Hello. Welcome to another video. My name is Steph. It's September, which is frankly ridiculous, but what can you do? I have 13 books to talk about that I read in August, and there's quite a big variety. I have poetry, nonfiction, fantasy, horror, thriller, and I would say this is also the month that finally broke my reading slump, specifically this very first book. So let's just start. So the first book that I read this month was God of the Woods. This was such a good book. It totally lived up to the hype. This book begins with the perspective of a camp counselor who was up to no good in the evening and comes back and discovers that one of her campers has gone missing. And not just one of the campers, but the daughter of the people who own the camp. Also, I'm realizing that the birds outside are super loud, so enjoy that springy ASMR type of music. I'm in Australia, it's spring, all of the animals are excited about it. So that timeline takes place in 1975. We do jump around to a few different heads, but I would kind of say that their main character is the camp counselor. We also go back in time because the missing girl, Barbara Van Laar, her brother also went missing in the very same woods like 20 years before. So we follow the search and jump between the heads of like the detectives and the mother and the camp counselor, all of these people who have different kind of stakes in finding Barbara, and we discover what happened not only to Barbara but also her brother. It might be the similarity between the names Wenger and Van Laar, but this really reminds me of Girl with the Dragon Tattoo in some ways. There's a lot of conversation about class and family histories that are kind of gross or muddy, and I just really enjoyed the setting between the 1950s and the 1970s. This book was just riveting. I could not put it down. I loved it. I really enjoyed it. I don't think there's anything terribly unusual about the book itself or the way that it's written, but it's just really well done. Like, all of the characters were interesting. We didn't get any dead time. It was just kind of consistently going along and unfolding this mystery and everything. It was great. That's all I have to say. It was great. It was a great thriller, especially for the summer, but I know that most people watching this are probably going into autumn, but you can read it in autumn too. The next book that I want to chat about is The Magic Toyshop by Angela Carter. I think this is Angela Carter's first book, and if you are not new here, I love Angela Carter's writing. She has a very lush, evocative kind of writing style and really heavily leans into the gothic and what's sort of uncomfortable or squicky and feminism. So this was originally published in the 80s? Oh no, in 1967. And we are following the perspective of Melanie. Melanie is 15. She is kind of having her sexual awakening. She's going through puberty and kind of discovering a lot of the things that come along with being a woman, good and bad. Really, the book kicks off when Melanie and her younger siblings' parents die in a car crash, and they have to go and live with their uncle Philip, who runs a toy shop, and it's not magical. I would say this is more like kind of magical realism, a little bit literary, very gothic. So she's living with her uncle Philip. He is kind of this angry character who really doesn't get a whole lot of page time until you're kind of closer to the end. A lot of the book is spent getting to know Philip's wife and his wife's brothers. That is Aunt Margaret, who has pretty much gone mute since she married Philip, and Finn and Francie. This took me a little bit of time to really get invested in the story because I wasn't totally sure where a lot of it was going. But it did kind of make me wonder if this could have, at least in part, inspired a series of unfortunate events, because we have that older sister who's 14, 15. We have a younger brother who's very bookish and smart. And then we have a baby. I can't remember her name at the moment, but I have no idea. But it did remind me of that a little bit, but this is much darker. This is not a book for children. But despite how dark it is, there is still this very fun flavor of vaudeville and almost absurdity. Really great read. I love Angela Carter. This just nailed that home for me. Although I would say it is probably not my favorite one of hers. The Bloody Chamber or Wise Children probably still takes the cake on that. Next, I want to talk about my 3 nonfiction books. So the very first one was Dinner on Monster Island. This is And I listened to this on audio as well. But this is a sort of memoir / reflection on being queer in Singapore and using a lot of analogies of horror and monstrosity to make sense of that experience. Okay. And the book kind of begins with the first essay where she grew up in a very conservative branch of Christianity, and her mother and grandmother and everybody kind of caught on that she was queer, and they tried to exorcise her. I have lived in Singapore for a very long time before we came to Australia. We're probably going to go back. My partner is Singaporean, so I found this really interesting to kind of get a glimpse of what that experience was like growing up through the 80s and 90s, early 2000s. I don't know if it's changed a whole lot, to be honest with you. This book deals a lot with state control, censorship, ownership of body, social shaming, and religious trauma. You can probably figure that out. I really enjoyed how she integrated motifs of horror and kind of famous horror moments. Even though I'm not really like somebody to watch a horror film, I'm familiar enough to follow and understand what kind of point she's making. And I found the way that she unpacked some of these tropes and related it to queerness and being brown and having a body that didn't fit the sort of ideals in Singapore. Really, really interesting, and kind of found some of the perspectives that she shared very validating in how I, as a foreigner, have gone in and experienced Singapore. You know, even though her experiences are very different, but like things that I have seen in the society that I found challenging, and also kind of questioned my own judgment or feelings of. I don't know if that makes sense, but I think this was a really great book and I really recommend it. As I said, she narrates the audiobook, which really added that extra level. Quote that she says, "My body was state property that needed to be punished and trained into compliance." I think she says that when she's describing this program that Singapore had. When I discovered my husband was in school, they still had it, called the Trim and Fit, or TAF Club, which my husband says in school was often just known as the Tough Club, where children who were overweight would be sort of isolated from the rest of the group and forced to do a lot of really intensive exercise, coming early and staying late, and really on an incredibly restrictive diet so that the school could meet their KPs. So that is Dinner on Monster Island. I think anybody who is interested in Singapore, the Singapore government, any Singaporeans who are looking for, I think, a very thoughtful critique of the state and the societal norms should really check this out. Okay, after that I read Madame Restell. The life, the death, the resurrection of old New York's most famous, fabulous, fearless, I'm saying this totally wrong. Most fabulous, fearless, and infamous abortionist. So this is pre-Gilded Age New York. That's like 1870s to 1890s, I believe. And in this, we are basically just following the history of Madame Restell, who was originally a factory girl, seamstress type of, who realized that she could make a lot of money by refashioning herself as a French woman who has brought her knowledge of abortions from Paris and selling it to her fellow Americans who were interested in birth control. So she did both birth control and surgical abortions and chemical abortions based on like the technology at the time, but she was definitely not the only person who was providing these services at the time. She was just the most infamous. She was very open about it, very out there, arguing that it was important that women had these options and that it is even good to control the size of your family, which was very controversial at the time. And I just found this was a very interesting, partly because I think it offers a really interesting, unique perspective on abortion in the United States, the history of it, and how there has always been this really Puritan approach to controlling women's bodies to varying degrees throughout history, and to hear how some of the arguments about abortion have not changed since the 1870s, 80s, 90s. Yeah, I just thought that it was a very timely book, a very interesting book, pretty easy to read. Like, it's not really like you're sitting there reading a textbook. There's a lot of very interesting excerpts from her advertisements in the newspapers. And I definitely recommend this if you are interested in the history of abortion, particularly in the United States, or if you're just looking for a really interesting feminist memoir. So that is Madame Restell. Fantastic cover as well, by the way. The next book that I want to talk about is also a nonfiction, that is Rage Becomes Her. As she kind of explains in the beginning of this book, this is not a self-help book. This is a book that's looking at the power of women's anger, why it is important, and how women have been socialized not to express anger, but to do other kind of behaviors instead, including internalization. And particularly in the latter half of the book, it talks about how that anger and expression, experiencing it, is really important, particularly for women, because it's part of liberation and is a tool in bringing about social change. I will be a bit harder on this book, not because I think that this is a bad book. I actually think it's really important and very valuable, but it does kind of drag on a little bit too long for me. I think if you're interested in this topic, you could probably just pull up one of her TED Talk type of lectures on YouTube and watch that first. And it's kind of the TLDR of this book. And then if you want more information, go get this book and read it. I appreciate that she digs into a lot of contemporary, like very recent research, recent to the publication of the book, which was in 2018. Because even when I go and look at some of the research, I can see that some of the things that I studied psychology in undergrad, I can see that some of the things that I was taught about women and being female in terms of a biological level were not correct. But I was still, at the time when I went to university years ago, being taught that that was correct, because that was based on the knowledge that we had at the time. But as a lot of people are aware, women's experiences and women's biology, women's health is not really prioritized historically in the research sphere. And so that's something that we're still updating and learning a lot about. And so, yeah, I think it definitely changed my perspective on anger and biology. So definitely recommend. It's a great book. Watch the TED Talk YouTube video first. I will maybe link one below if I remember, and have fun with that. The next book that I read was a nice quick horror novella, that is What Feasts at Night by T. Kingfisher. This is part 2, kind of set in a fake country in our world, and our main character, who we are following through the first book and now the second book, is a veteran, but it sounds kind of more like World War One, but it's not World War One. And they have like PTSD. Their name is Alex. Book 1, I should also say, is based on The Fall of House of Usher, the short story by Edgar Allan Poe. I don't think that this book is based on anything, but please correct me if I'm wrong. This follows Alex staying at another kind of house cabin type of location with some friends and discovering there is something feasting at night. This is a totally different kind of issue from the one that we explored in the first book. It's leaning a bit more creature feature, folk horror. I loved it. I loved it way more than the first book, partly probably because I know the main character a little bit more and I tend to be a very character-driven reader. But there is also this element of Alex Easton running around and like talking to villagers who are all like really scared of this creature, getting to know what the sort of lore is of the area, all of that. I just had a really good time. I enjoyed this a lot. The next book that I read was part of a reading vlog. That is The Ancestor by Danielle Trussoni. This was a very weird book, and like the experience of reading it was like woo. So I will link the vlog below if you want to come with me through that whole experience. But in The Ancestor, we are following Alberta, or Bert Monte. Now, her and her husband have been experiencing a lot of miscarriages, and they're now kind of on the brink of separation, or they have recently separated, but things are still kind of amicable, and she's just not doing well or okay, and she needs a change. Well, one day she gets a letter saying that she is actually Countess Alberta Monteblanco, and she has to go to Italy, to this really small town that is kind of adjacent to a enormous castle-like manor that is really isolated, and you have to fly in because it's winter. It's only accessible by air because of all the snow. We're in the Alps or something like that. And she begins to learn a little bit about her family history and her family past. This is not what I expected it was going to be, because you're kind of getting a lot of gothic tropes thrown at you in the beginning, and there's a lot of very polarizing reviews about this. At the 60% midpoint, there's a huge change in the type of story that you're being told, and it's almost sci-fi, like almost sci-fi horror, but it's not cosmic. It's very strange. It's very, very strange, and that's all I really know about how to talk about it. I did end up enjoying this. I thought it was well written, but I mean, go in just knowing that it's not gonna go the way you think it's gonna go. Even if you're really good at picking up on all the little clues that the author has left for you, probably no. After that, I read The Mist because I was looking for some cosmic horror, apparently. The fact that King can make this kind of horror scary to me is kind of an achievement. I don't tend to find cosmic leaning stuff very frightening. So in this, we're following a family, a man and his son, and his wife, but she doesn't really matter. There has been like a big storm and a power outage at this vacation home type of place where they live full time, but a lot of people are only there for the summer. And they quickly go to the only grocery store along with pretty much everybody else who's like, we gotta get food or whatever we need in case this power outage lasts longer. And then they get trapped in the grocery store because there is this silvery mist that traps them in the store. I had a moment when I was reading this thinking about the pandemic and how people just went insane. And there was just this level of craziness with people's own anxiety provoking them to behave like lunatics in a grocery store. And it is totally different in this book, but there was a moment where I was thinking back going like, oh, King knew how people would respond to a really stressful situation. Like, that's what makes his book so good, is that we are in this main character's mind and he is freaking out and worrying, and then you're starting to feel all of the worry and anxiety too. Very good. Not the same as his other books because it's only like just under 200 pages or so. You don't get as attached to the characters. It doesn't have the same kind of emotional or thematic depth, I think, in some ways, but it is a really fun, quick, creepy, stressful little read, and I'm glad that I picked it up. That was The Mist. After that, I read another book for my reading blog. That is Lady Macbeth by Ava Reid. So this is a retelling of Lady Macbeth, but I do feel like there might be a bit of a marketing issue because there is a lot of influence from Marie de France's Lays. I'm so sorry to the French people. I'm mispronouncing everything. Because our main character is French, and there is sort of this aspect of monster transformation, monster boy kind of thing that is in this that is not in the original story. And there's a lot of creative liberties taken in terms of developing the setting and the story. And so I think that this has been maybe a little bit polarizing. Generally, I enjoyed it, but I would not say that it was my favorite Ava Reid book necessarily. Some of that is that it felt a little too short for some of the development that I think needed to happen. Some of that is that she aged down Lady Macbeth. So the book kicks off with the lady, Restell, when she is, I believe, 17. And I understand that the author is doing this because she, in her books, I think just generally, thematically tends to focus on youth, beauty, power, patriarchy, power dynamics, trauma. I think she actually does that really well. And another thing that she kind of added to this to continue that theme or that exploration is that Lady Macbeth has sort of magic powers in this, and she can ensorcel people. So most of her life she has had to wear this veil over her face because she has this tendency to drive men to madness. And this is also kind of an analogy for like lust or whatever, but she does have this power that comes into play in the book as well. So yeah, I don't know. I struggled with some aspects of this book. I got some very thoughtful comments from people who were Scottish and really struggled with some of the portrayal of, first of all, the Scottish people, the Scottish language. I've heard that the audiobook has incorrect pronunciation of the location that Macbeth is originally set in. And because Lady Restell is someone that has been married off kind of against her will to Macbeth, this much older man, she really perceives him as brutish, and she really hates Scotland, and you're getting a very close perspective of her experience and her thoughts in that. So I guess that's something to kind of note going in. But if you like Ava Reid, you might like this too. But I do think that some of the enjoyment from this will come out of appreciating the other influences that are at play in this as well. It was okay. It was not her best in my opinion. I would still point people to Juniper and Thorn. I'm pointing at my shelf because it's somewhere over there, but I'm not going to go get it if you can handle something that is a bit more horror leaning. So that is Lady Macbeth. After that, also in the same reading vlog, I read A Guest in the House. I don't have the book with me anymore. I had to send it back to the library. So you can go to the vlog and see what the artwork is like, but it is beautiful. It is a wonderful graphic novel. I do not know if I am smart enough to really follow what happened in the end, but I do recommend it. It's kind of type of story that you go along for the art and just the ride of it. Okay, so in this we're following a woman who is quite young. She's married an older man. There's some very strong Rebecca vibes here, except that this older man has a child from his previous marriage, and she spends a lot of time trying to befriend the child, but the child is really hung up on her mother and like staring into the water at the end of the dock that they have newly moved into. Well, they haven't moved into the dock. They've moved into the house near the dock, but you know what I mean. There's a lot of kind of weird, creepy things. And this woman, she really doesn't have a great, strong sense of herself in some ways. She's kind of disconnected from who she used to be or who she could be. So the artwork is all like black and white, and then there's these sequences where she's having like dreams and thoughts about what happened to the wife that came before her, this mysterious woman that the stepdaughter or stepchild, it might be a queer stepchild, I don't remember, is really obsessed with. And so she kind of becomes obsessed with her too. I am not usually the kind of person who enjoys poetry. I'm just not a poetry girl, or so I thought. That is mostly because I have come across poetry on Pinterest or like Instagram, and they just don't necessarily hit with me. I have a few favorites from like Mary Oliver, Margaret Atwood. I just have not clicked with poetry in the past until I read A Hymn for the Black Terrific by Kiki Petrosino. This hits so hard. This, just on a craft level, I'm so envious of the way that this writer uses words. So as you can probably guess, this little poetry, I don't know, are they called chapbooks? Is focusing on a lot of issues around race, particularly how blackness, whiteness, being Asian kind of interacts with the art world, whether it's history or writing or paintings, but specifically focusing on the experiences of being a Black woman and a Black creative person. I just thought that there was so much sophistication and elegance in, yeah, how she used words. I thought this was just a wonderful, it's a great book. I totally recommend if anybody hasn't had success with poetry, or you really love poetry and you haven't read this book, please read this, because it made me think and could be confronting, but it was also comforting and hopeful in certain areas. There was a range of emotion and a range of experiences captured in like 50 pages, and it was a beautiful book. It really, really was. And I'm incredibly frustrated that I don't have it with me because I had to return it to the library. So I can't read you any of it. I wish that I could. Please just go pick it up. I have two more books to talk about. The next one is Queen of Shadows by Sarah J. Maas. I started the series earlier, a few months back. Because the series is so popular, I'm not going to really spend a lot of time recapping it. We are just following Selena Sardothien, who is like this assassin who's trying to reclaim her kingdom and deal with all of the politics things. I really enjoyed Queen of Shadows. I feel like the previous books in the series I struggled with a little bit. Like they felt more YA for me, and I wasn't connecting with them as much. I still had fun, and I continued because they were, entertaining diversions, but they weren't clicking with me on a really deep level. Something about this one, I think the character matures and grows a lot, but also the setting, I just love. We have a lot more kind of city setting that feels more like Crescent City, but better edited. It was fun. it was fun to see the character running around and scheming, and to see the kind of world building get fleshed out a little bit more, like the cosmology. I'm starting to really enjoy the series. I picked up Empire of Storms, I think is the next one, and I've gotten started on that already. So that's Queen of Shadows, Sarah J. Maas. It's going pretty well, the SJM sphere for me. The last book that I want to talk about is possibly the one that got me like fully out of my reading slump that I had been going through since like June. That is A Sorceress Comes to Call by T. Kingfisher. This is her best book. This is her best book. And I say that having loved a lot of her other stories. I really enjoyed What Feasts at Night. This one's the best. It is so good. So this is a retelling of The Goose Girl. It's a full-length novel, and it's a loose retelling of The Goose Girl. Okay, so we're following this young woman who is 14 or 15, and we learn almost immediately that her mother is an enchantress or a sorceress, and she is kind of a wicked one, like sincerely evil. The first couple of pages we find out that she practices this type of magic she calls obedience on her daughter, where she pretty much takes control of her daughter's body, and like her daughter is conscious and aware within her own body, but her mom like doesn't care and will like use her to do and say things, and it's really quite abusive. She talks about in the like very early on how her mom like used to forget to like send her to the bathroom so she would wet herself because her mom just didn't give a shit. So, you know, maybe a content warning for some people. So we get this girl's perspective, okay? But we also get the perspective of an older woman named Hester. I forgot what the girl's, oh, Cordelia is the girl. So Hester is this older woman who's never been married. She lives with her brother, who's kind of a doofus, and so her life really revolves around protecting her brother from all of his stupid decisions. One of his stupid decisions is flirting it up and kind of inviting this enchantress woman, not realizing she's an enchantress, to come and stay with them along with her daughter, and he's essentially courting her. The sorceress wants to marry him for money, and Hester, the older woman, the sister, is like, I need to run interference with this because this is just not good. So this is kind of a novel of manners mashed up together with a Grimm's fairy tale plus an evil enchantress, which is kind of a Grimm's fairy tale. So yeah, Cordelia and Hester are almost working against each other without realizing it and living together, and they end up just developing a very sweet relationship while all of this absolutely crazy stuff goes on. Crazy stuff. So that's A Sorceress Comes to Call. I kind of feel like, okay, that was almost a perfect book for me. I want more, but I also don't, you know? So if you haven't read this, it would be good for anybody who, actually, I think that anybody who liked, what is that fairy book? It's green and it's a very different vibe, but it's kind of vaguely similar in like the aesthetic or like the feel. I'll put it somewhere in this area. It's a little bit darker, but so that's what I read in August. Thank you very much for watching this video. I would love to hear about the books that you read, and if you've read any of the books that I've read, tell me about what your thoughts are. Let's hear them. Thanks so much for watching. I will see you very soon in another video. Bye!